Is it easier to get a PSA 10 or a CGC 10? If you have a vintage card, which company should you send it to? Stay tuned and we'll find out. All right, so take a look at this spreadsheet. I'm going to make it available in the description so you can download it and see it for yourself. I'm going to explain a little bit how it works. So what I did is I took 15 of the most graded cards at PSA and CGC, not the top 15, but 15 of the most graded. And I wanted to compare what their grades were like. I tried to get a broad swath of the hobby: modern, vintage, Japanese, English, holo, full arts, etc., so that you could get a sense of what grading is like between each of them. The first thing I'll draw your attention to is for every single card except for one, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, PSA has more graded. PSA is this lighter color here. If you just look down this entire row, on every single one, PSA has more graded. Now, sometimes it's closer than in other cases. Like if you look over here with this Japanese promo, it's pretty close, 8 to 10,000. Or this Hidden Fates promo, this is the Legendary Birds. It's pretty close between the two companies, but in other cases, it's just not even close. Like this is base set Unlimited Charizard, and PSA is graded 7 to 8 times as many cards, which is pretty substantial. Even among this Champions Path Charizard, which has just been graded to hell, PSA is graded about twice the amount, which is quite a lot if you think about it. The only exception is this card right here, the Confetti Pikachu, which came with the McDonald's set. And as you can see, there's been over 2,000 graded at CGC and 0. I couldn't find the card at all. Maybe I'm missing something, but I couldn't find it at all at PSA. And it would make sense. This is not a super expensive card. It came out in 2021 when the minimum amount to grade was $100 and then $50. So it makes sense that people were not sending this card to PSA because it was just too expensive and it's not the sort of card you'd want to grade. So in this case, this card, about 2,000 went to CGC and none to PSA. So as you'd expect, almost no cards have gotten this perfect 10 at CGC. The card that's gotten the most, almost 2% here, is this Japanese modern promo, which is what you'd expect to be the strongest contender, because Japanese usually grades better than English and modern better than vintage. But even then, it's almost 2%. On every single other metric here, you can find that almost no cards are getting graded as a perfect 10 at CGC. Some had 0, many had 0 in fact, and even then, it was usually about 0.1% here for the cards that did have examples of a perfect 10. But if you move on to the pristine 10, it's also kind of a similar story. Very few, about 1%, in some cases 0. Look, you got Charizard from Evolutions, the Charizard from Base Set Unlimited. There's 0 examples of CGC pristine 10s. Obviously, I just mean PSA 10 here to compare it to. And you're going to see this really defined at this modern card set because at PSA, they're awarding, a majority, sometimes an overwhelming number of 10s. If you're looking at this Japanese promo, 85% are 10s. If you're looking at the Champions Path promo that everyone's graded, over 55% here are graded as a 10, and only 0.5%, think about that, that's 1 in 200, as opposed to half, are graded 10s at CGC, which is pretty shocking. And even if you add up all the 9.5 examples at CGC with the 10s, because as you know, PSA doesn't really do the subgrades, you're still about half the number that you got at the 10s out of PSA. So if you combine all the pristine, perfect 10s and the 9.5s, you're still halfway to the regular PSA 10s. It's pretty shocking, and that's pretty true across the board if you look down this list. Only when you get to the CGC 9s, you start to catch up to the PSA 10s. Usually, if you get all the way down here, you're going to find more 9.5s, 10 perfect 10s altogether than the PSA 10 of comparable value. So, if you could equate it, I would say that, a CGC 9.5 is definitely a 10. A 10 is like, an 11 compared to PSA. And at 9s, if PSA had a subgrade that was like a 9.5, really the CGC 9s would fall between 9.5 and 10s, most of them. There aren't 8.5s at PSA, but in CGC, you're seeing a pretty substantial number of CGC 8.5s across the board. And you really see it defined here with this Evolutions Charizard, for example. And almost half here, 45% of the Charizards graded at CGC are CGC 8.5s, and another 34% are 9s. Whereas on the PSA side, yes, only 2% are 10s, but almost 60% here are 9s. Pretty substantial differentiation. You know, what I really think is interesting when you make it down the board here is that if you look at the under 7, so I lumped in pretty much all the low grades under 7, you're going to find that in some examples there's more or a comparable number of PSA low grades. So if you look at this base set limited Charizard, for example, there's actually over half of the PSA ones are a low grade. There's lots of hypotheses for this, and we're going to get to some of the other numbers down the list that show that actually PSA is harder on vintage cards at the lower grades than CGC is, which is a little surprising given the rep. There's some potential explanations. You know, you could guess that lots of people sent in their Charizards before the cutoff. You could guess that people, if they have a low quality Charizard, are just more likely to send it off to PSA than CGC, and so you're likely to have a lot of lower grades. But it doesn't always make sense, because if you have a better quality Charizard, I would also be more likely to send it to PSA because it's going to be worth a lot more if it gets a high grade. So I'm not really sure about this distinction. We're going to talk about it a little more later. You've got some other shocking numbers. You know, this is a modern character rare, where at PSA 92% are PSA 10s, which is pretty shocking. That's an overwhelming number. And even here's a vintage card, you know, Pikachu from Expedition, not a holo, just the plain Pikachu, is getting about over half at PSA 10s and 33% at PSA 9s. Whereas at CGC, you have almost no 10s and less than 30% being 9s. So, yeah, now I want to move on to the totals. I'm going to move myself here so that it's easier to read down there. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a floating head. But down here, what you're going to find through these rows are the totals. And I also differentiated between modern and non-modern because I think it's easier to see trends. Because actually, right here, I calculated the proportion of modern and vintage at each of the companies. And what you're going to find is that CGC, over 3/4 are modern cards, whereas at PSA, just over 60% are. So almost double the number of vintage cards graded at PSA among my sample than CGC, which is interesting. I don't know why. You think that maybe, you know, modern cards skyrocketed in value during the pandemic and PSA closed grading, so everyone was just sending it to CGC, and that might be why it's so disproportionate. Another reason could be, you know, PSA's open for a lot longer. They've graded far more cards. And so before, if you were going to get a card graded, it was always vintage. It would never be modern. So that could be another explanation. But because of that, you can actually see a disparity. So what you're going to find in this row is for each grade, the proportion split between modern and vintage. And then over here, I did the cumulative total. Which is like all the grades so far up until this point. So see, up until the 10s, overall, about 1/3 of PSA's cards are coming back a 10, and only less than 1% are coming back CGC 10. And about 22%, if you include 10s and 9.5s, are coming back at CGC 9.5s or higher. But you really start seeing differentiation when you get down to the modern and the vintage, which I think is the most interesting. Because what you find over here is that in this final column, which is the number of low-graded vintage cards, you're going to find that PSA gives out almost 50% more as a proportion, 38% almost versus 24% of PSA vintage grades below a 7. So think about that. If you're sending a card to either of these two companies and it's a vintage card, your likelihood of getting a low grade is almost 50% more. Now, why could this be? As I said earlier, it could be that people are just more likely to send their lower quality vintage cards to PSA because they'll at least hold some value and CGC is lower. I'm not so sure. I think that the more likely reason is maybe they just are harsher at grading. And so some people have provided explanations I've talked to is that CGC is very harsh on the surface grades, like if there's a binder crease or something like that, or an indent, because in PSA that's an automatic 6, which would put it in this category right here. Whereas in CGC it's possible to get an 8 or so if you have an indent, because they're not nearly as harsh. And that really could be what's playing the role here, because if you had your cards in a binder set and you sent them off to both companies, it would make sense, given what we know about surface grading, that you're going to have an easier time at CGC. So that's kind of breaks the stereotype, I think, because when we think CGC, we always think, oh, the grading at CGC is tougher, and here we see a clear example of not. If your card is vintage and it's not terrific quality, it seems like you have a better chance at CGC here. Now, I don't know about values. It could be that even, a PSA 6 is worth more than a CGC 8. I'm not so sure that that holds true in all examples. I haven't looked at the data. Those are all things to consider. And so looking at these cumulative totals, which I think is interesting to look at next, what you find is that among modern, by the time you get to grade 9s, I don't know if I'd call this parity, because there's definitely this huge disparity at 10s, but I think it's fair to say that many 9s are at least in condition about equivalent to PSA 10s, which we have been talking about in the past. We know this, right? And by the time you get to the 9 grade, it's the disparity is almost gone. It's not completely gone, right? 77 versus 85% of the cards, but it is far less stark than it thought really to be top high grades. At the vintage place, it's kind of a similar story. It's not, but proportionally speaking, PSA is giving out a lot more of these higher grades. I think it's in this mid tier, right, where CGC is giving out far more 7s and 8s at the vintage compared to PSA. PSA is more at the poles. They're giving out more low grades and more high grades, but not this kind of like mid-high tier. So anyway, that's the data I got. I hope you found it interesting and the conclusions I took away from it. I'm going to make the spreadsheet publicly available. Feel free to let me know your comments and your thoughts about what we found so far, if you're interested in how other cards performed between the two companies. And one other note, I said I would be tracking the pop reports of CGC each week. I went back to do that last week, and some of the cards, only got 10 or 15 more grades in a week, and that's just not enough to make comparisons between how they've been grading in the past. So I think I'm going to do it every month instead, so that we actually have real data to compare to. Thanks so much, and have a good one.